Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started.
It was supposed to be just another late shift. I clocked out a little after midnight, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. The rain had started an hour before my shift ended, but by the time I left work, it had turned into a full-blown storm. I remember thinking how unlucky I was to be driving my old 2005 Ford Fusion through this mess, and as I trudged through the parking lot, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the nearly deserted lot. The car smelled faintly of old leather and coffee stains, comfortable but nowhere near reliable for this kind of weather. I cursed as I slid into the driver's seat and struggled to get the engine to turn over. Eventually, it did, but the windshield wipers worked overtime to clear the relentless rain, barely keeping up with the downpour. I drove at barely 40 miles an hour, way under the limit, but it felt like I was barreling through an endless sheet of water. About halfway home, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the headlights. My heart shot to my throat as I slammed on the brakes. This person, a man dressed head to toe in white, was crossing the road right in front of me, coming out of the dark trees and heading straight into more of them on the other side. I didn't have time to avoid him entirely. All I could do was swerve sharply, and my tires lost grip on the slick road. The world spun, and I heard the awful crunch of metal as I crashed into a tree by the roadside. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the pounding rain. The airbags had deployed, smacking me hard across the face, leaving me dazed and confused. My hands shook as I tried to clear my head. The car was silent except for the steady hum of the engine dying. I was lucky, I thought. I didn't hit him. I hadn't hurt anyone, but where had he gone? The headlights were still shining on the empty stretch of road in front of me, but there was no sign of him. No one should have been out here, dressed like that, especially in the middle of a storm at this hour. I grabbed my phone and tried to call my brother, Ben, then my sister, Jenna. No answer. The thunder was loud enough to drown out my sigh of frustration. I had to try someone else. Finally, I dialed my dad. He picked up after the second ring, his voice groggy but immediately alert as I explained what happened. He told me to stay in the car, lock the doors, and that he'd be there in 15 minutes tops. I exhaled, feeling a bit calmer, but the silence pressed in on me, broken only by the rain's relentless hammering on the roof and windows. I sat back in the seat, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that there was nothing out there. Still, the memory of that figure crossing the road stayed in my mind, a nagging question I couldn't shake. Who in their right mind would be wandering through a storm like this? Minutes ticked by, and I felt my anxiety growing again. I typed out a quick message to Dad, asking if he was close, and he replied that he'd be there soon, just a couple minutes away. I sighed in relief and tried to breathe. Then, in the periphery of my vision, something caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat as I saw him, the man in white. He was standing right outside the passenger side window, drenched, staring directly at me. His face was twisted into a grimace, his mouth forming a strange, almost unnatural O shape, his eyes narrowed as if scrutinizing me, judging me. My pulse raced as he lifted a hand, dragging his fingers down the window, leaving streaks of water and fog. I instinctively reached for the door lock to make sure it was secure, trying not to make any sudden movements. He wasn't just staring, he was trying the door handle, tugging on it, then banging his fist against the glass when it wouldn't open. Each thud made me jump, my heart hammering in my chest. I fumbled for my phone, pressing it to my ear, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely keep it steady. "Dad," I whispered, my voice choked with fear. "He's here. There's someone outside. He's trying to get in." Dad's voice was tense, trying to calm me down, telling me to stay calm and not to open the door. The man outside slammed his hands harder against the window, his face twisted in that same horrific, vacant expression. I was practically crying, clinging to the phone as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. Through my terror, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded over me as I realized it was Dad's truck. But the man didn't stop. He kept pounding on the window, his face pressing against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. I wanted to scream, but the sight of Dad's truck growing closer gave me strength to hold it in. When the man noticed the lights, he turned, eyes flicking toward the oncoming vehicle, and then he bolted back toward the woods. Dad leapt out of his truck and ran toward the figure without hesitation. I watched, feeling both horrified and grateful, as he caught up to the man and tackled him to the ground in the rain. I scrambled out of the car, shouting for him to stop, but my dad didn't hear me, or maybe he didn't care. He was furious, holding the man down, his fists raining down blows as the man tried, unsuccessfully, to protect himself. When Dad finally looked up, rain running down his face, his chest heaving, I could see the man lying there, barely conscious, blood mixing with the rain. I was still in shock when the tow truck arrived, the driver standing there, clearly bewildered by what he'd walked into. I felt dizzy as I dialed 911, barely able to explain what had happened as I watched the man lying limp on the muddy roadside. The police arrived not long after, shining flashlights on the man as they pulled him to his feet. I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were empty, distant, almost like he wasn't even there. They said his name was Marcus Green. They found him with a pocket knife and an old, worn notebook filled with names I didn't recognize, names with addresses and cryptic notes scrawled next to them. Mine wasn't in it, but that didn't make me feel any better. After taking my statement, the officers hauled Marcus into their car, and Dad and I drove home in silence, the relief of finally leaving that place behind not erasing the horror that clung to me. Weeks went by, and we had a court date, though I didn't go. I couldn't bring myself to face Marcus again, to see that blank expression that had haunted my dreams. Dad and a lawyer handled everything. Marcus was convicted, thankfully, but it didn't ease the fear. Sometimes, even now, I still wake up in the middle of the night, seeing his face pressed against the window, his mouth twisted in that unnatural O. They say he's behind bars, but it doesn't feel like enough. I know that memory is burned into my mind, a reminder that some things stay with you forever. That stormy night, a night I should have just driven home and gone to bed, became something darker, something I can't escape. They say justice was served, but justice doesn't erase fear. Justice doesn't keep you safe in the dark, and justice certainly doesn't help you sleep through the night. I'll never forget that night. It was one of those humid, heavy August evenings in Florida, the air thick, almost stifling, as if it were building up to something. My son, Milo, and I had this little ritual whenever a storm rolled in. We'd head out to the gazebo in the backyard, set up camp with some snacks, and just watch. Something about the power of a storm, the raw energy of the thunder and lightning, made us feel alive. My wife, Amanda, usually stayed inside. She never understood why we found storms so fascinating. That night, the storm came on fast. It started with a gentle patter of rain, then escalated. Thunder cracked, followed by flashes that lit up the entire yard. The gazebo was our safe haven, cozy, with a small sofa, a mini bar, a TV, and even a little fireplace for the colder nights. As the rain beat down harder, Milo and I leaned back, listening to the rhythm, enjoying that primal mix of fear and awe that storms bring. Then, suddenly, Milo stiffened beside me. His hand shot out, pointing towards the line of trees at the far end of our yard. His voice was barely a whisper, "Dad, there's someone out there." At first, I thought he was just imagining things. After all, the flicker of lightning and shadows often play tricks on the eyes. But something in his voice made me pay attention. I leaned forward, squinting through the rain, and waited for the next flash of lightning. When it came, bright and jagged, I saw it, a dark figure, standing just beyond the tree line. My heart skipped. "Stay here," I muttered, getting up and moving to the edge of the gazebo, hoping to get a better look. Another flash illuminated the figure. It was a person, tall and unmoving, partially hidden by the shadows. A chill crept down my spine. Milo's eyes were wide with fear. "Go inside, kiddo," I told him. "Turn on the back lights." He hesitated but nodded, sprinting toward the house. When the floodlights came on, the yard lit up, stark and bright. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. No movement, no sign that anyone had been there. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to a trick of the storm and shadows, but a sense of unease settled in my gut. I joined Milo inside, locked the back door, and turned on every light I could. Amanda gave me a puzzled look, but I brushed it off, telling her it was just a strange moment. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, at least for a while. We settled in for a movie, the sound of rain and thunder a comforting backdrop. Milo had calmed down, and as the storm continued, the tension started to fade. But later, after we'd put him to bed, I saw him come back into the living room, his face pale. "Dad," he said, his voice barely audible, "there's someone outside my window." I froze. My first thought was that he'd just had a bad dream. I glanced at Amanda. Her face was a mix of worry and confusion. Together, we went to his room and looked out the window. Nothing. Just sheets of rain and the occasional lightning. But the fear in Milo's eyes was undeniable, so I decided to check around the house. Grabbing a baseball bat from the closet, I went outside. The rain had softened, but the lightning was still sharp and frequent. I circled the house, my senses on high alert. Everything seemed normal until I reached the side of the house. Another flash lit up the yard, and I saw him, the same figure, closer now, partially hidden by the wall's shadow. He wore a dark hoodie, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, his presence felt menacing, almost unnatural. I yelled, gripping the bat tightly, and took a step forward. The figure slid back into the shadows, vanishing around the corner. My heart raced as I followed, but when I rounded the corner, he was gone. Vanished. It didn't make sense, there was nowhere for him to go. It was like he'd just melted into the darkness. When I returned inside, I tried to downplay what I'd seen, telling Amanda and Milo that I'd scared him off. I didn't want them to worry, especially not Milo. But inside, I felt shaken. I'd seen him twice now, and he was real. After that, we locked all the windows and drew the curtains tight. Milo slept with us that night, curled up between me and Amanda. I lay awake, listening to the storm outside and wondering if I'd see him again. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I kept the backyard lights on at night, checked the locks obsessively, even started walking around the property with the bat once or twice just to reassure myself. Each time I did, there was nothing. No sign of the man, no tracks in the muddy earth near the house. Then, one evening a week later, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye as I was taking out the trash. I turned quickly, and there he was, standing just beyond the gazebo, his face half hidden beneath the hoodie. My breath caught, and I took a step back. For the first time, I noticed something disturbing. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but one that seemed empty, cold, like he knew something I didn't. "Hey!" I shouted, but he didn't move. He just watched me, that eerie smile never leaving his face. I backed up, retreating toward the house, keeping my eyes on him the entire time. When I got inside, I locked the door and grabbed the phone to call the police. My hands were shaking as I explained what had been happening. They said they'd send someone over, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They didn't find anything, no footprints, no trace that anyone had been there at all. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light from outside felt like he was there, watching. I knew Amanda thought I was overreacting, but I could see she was worried too, if only because I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. And Milo, he wouldn't even go near his bedroom window. I hated that he was scared, that I couldn't protect him from whatever this was. Weeks passed, and though we didn't see him again, the fear never really left. Each night, I'd double-check the doors and windows, look out into the yard, half expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows. And sometimes, late at night when everything was quiet, I'd hear faint footsteps outside, just beyond our line of sight. I'd look, but there was never anything there. I tried to move on, to tell myself it was all in my head, but every now and then, I'd catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I'd turn quickly, heart pounding, but the yard would be empty. Milo would ask if the man was gone, and I'd tell him yes, that he'd left and wouldn't be coming back. But the truth was, I didn't know. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking, waiting. It was supposed to be the kind of night where you relax, maybe let your guard down. I'd met Maddie through a friend, and we'd been texting back and forth for weeks, really clicking in that effortless way that almost feels too good to be true. So, I figured a relaxed first date was in order. We decided to head to one of those secluded beaches where you can drive your pickup right up to the water, toss some firewood in a pile, and let the night unfold however it wants. Mid-July meant the evening air would still be warm enough, with just the right amount of salt on the breeze. Perfect setting for a little late-night adventure. I picked her up around 9 p.m., just as the sunset was fading. We stopped by a 7-Eleven on the way to grab some wood, beer, and snacks. Typical first date essentials, nothing too fancy or formal. Maddie was laughing and talking, leaning over to mess with the radio, and everything about the night felt easy. Perfect, even. When we got to the beach, I steered us toward the quieter end. I'd been there a few times before and knew it stayed pretty empty on weekdays. We parked up near the dunes, where tall grass clumped together, almost hiding the beach from the road. I figured that little pocket of privacy would be nice, keeping us away from any curious beachgoers. Once we were settled, I tried to get the fire going. It didn't go as planned. Despite all the Boy Scout tutorials I'd watched, I fumbled around for what felt like forever. Maddie just laughed, finding it amusing as I repeatedly failed to light even a spark. I could feel my cheeks burning with embarrassment, but her laughter eased it a bit. We gave up on the fire after a few more failed attempts and just cracked open the beers, leaning back against the truck's tailgate and letting the dark, peaceful surroundings work their magic. The only sounds were the quiet rumble of the waves and the occasional breeze rustling the beach grass. We had just started to relax when Maddie froze, tilting her head slightly. I noticed her eyes darting around, scanning the darkness. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hadn't heard anything unusual, so I shrugged it off. "It's probably just a bird," I reassured her. But then, I heard it too, a soft, almost playful whistle. It wasn't the sort of sound a bird would make, nor did it have the rhythm of someone casually passing by. It was too deliberate, too slow, echoing through the dunes and fading into the ocean air. It sent a chill down my spine. Trying to be rational, I scanned the area, but the darkness was almost impenetrable. I turned to Maddie, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. In the hopes of shaking off the eerie vibe, I pulled out my phone flashlight and shone it toward the dunes. Just for a quick look, just to reassure her. The flashlight beam cut through the tall grass, and for a second, everything looked normal. But then I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the reach of the light, I saw the back of a man's head. He was crouched low, maybe 20 or 30 yards away, the outline of his figure barely visible against the night. My heart slammed against my chest as the man slowly stood up. He didn't look toward us. Instead, he seemed to almost casually slip further back into the dunes, like he'd been caught and was now retreating. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. I shouted out, "Hey! Get out of here," trying to sound brave, like I had everything under control. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he melted back into the tall grass, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. It was as if the dunes had swallowed him whole. Maddie was visibly shaken, clutching her arms as if to protect herself from the chills settling over us. I wanted to follow him, to see where he'd gone, but something held me back, maybe Maddie's pleading eyes, or the heavy feeling of dread that had settled into the pit of my stomach. I took out my phone and flicked on the flashlight again, trying to search for any sign of the guy. But the light seemed feeble against the vast darkness of the beach, swallowed up by the towering grass that lined the dunes. "Maybe we should just go back to the truck," Maddie suggested, her voice trembling. She looked ready to bolt, her body tensed like a coiled spring. I wanted to be the tough guy, the one who stayed calm and collected. But even as I considered her suggestion, another sharp whistle echoed through the air, closer this time. The eerie sound was so close that it made my skin prickle. It felt like the guy was toying with us, like he was deliberately letting us know he was still there, lurking somewhere nearby. Reluctantly, I led Maddie back to the truck, keeping the flashlight pointed toward the dunes, half expecting to see him pop out again. But there was only silence, broken only by the occasional crash of the waves. Maddie climbed into the passenger seat, and I slid in beside her, both of us gripping our seats as though we could somehow push the fear away by holding on tightly enough. The thought of leaving felt like giving in, but the idea of staying any longer with that stranger out there, watching us, was even worse. The darkness around us had become heavy, almost suffocating, as if it was closing in. I started the engine, leaving the headlights off for a moment, curious if the guy would show himself. Maddie was breathing shallowly beside me, clutching her knees to her chest. I could feel the unease gnawing at her, and to be honest, I was on edge, too. Just then, through the shadows at the edge of the headlights, I saw movement. A face, pale, expressionless, appeared from the grass, staring directly at us. It was only visible for a split second before disappearing again, vanishing back into the blackness of the dunes. It was so quick, so subtle, that I almost doubted I'd seen it at all. I flipped the headlights on, casting bright light over the empty beach, and the figure was gone. Maddie gripped my arm, her fingers digging in, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's just get out of here. Please." I hesitated for a moment, the fight or flight instinct kicking in. Part of me wanted to confront this creep, to drag him out of the dunes and demand answers. But Maddie's voice, filled with fear, snapped me back to reality. It wasn't worth the risk. Not tonight. As I reversed out of the sand, my eyes kept flicking to the side mirrors, expecting to see him sprinting after us. But all I saw was darkness, the tall grass rustling as if hiding some unseen danger, something we couldn't shake. The only sound was the crunch of sand beneath the truck tires as we pulled away from that secluded stretch of beach, leaving behind the whispering grass and the chilling silence. Even as we sped down the winding beach road, the eerie whistle seemed to linger in the air, trailing after us like a shadow that refused to be left behind. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting that ghostly face to appear again, chasing us down the empty stretch of road. Beside me, Maddie sat silent, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes darting anxiously out the window as if she was afraid the stranger might suddenly materialize beside her. The truck's engine rumbled louder than usual in the dead silence, amplifying the thick tension that had settled between us. I could still hear the echo of that eerie whistle, taunting us, playing over and over in my head like a warning we'd narrowly escaped. But what bothered me more was the calmness of the guy, no yelling, no threats, just watching, like he knew we were trapped, his silent little game. And the worst part? I had no idea if he'd given up, if we were really safe now, or if he was just waiting for another moment to strike. When we reached a more secluded part of the beach road, Maddie let out a shaky breath. Can we just pull over for a minute? I don't want to go back yet." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and I could tell she was still rattled. She wanted reassurance that the guy hadn't somehow followed us, lurking in the shadows of the trees or blending into the darkness. I nodded, reluctantly pulling the truck off onto a gravelly shoulder, where the beach grasses grew thick and tall around us. We'd moved far enough away from the water that the air felt cooler, less salt-laden. I killed the engine, and silence settled around us. It was the kind of stillness that seemed almost unnatural, thick and impenetrable, as though the night itself was holding its breath. For a few moments, neither of us moved, too scared to even talk about what had just happened. But then, out of nowhere, that same haunting whistle broke the silence again. It was so close that it jolted me upright in my seat. Maddie gasped, covering her mouth as her eyes widened in terror. I fumbled with the headlights, slamming them on, and just barely caught sight of a figure, moving in and out of the beams as it slipped between the trees a mere 10 steps from the truck. It was him, that same stranger, watching us, like he'd known exactly where we'd pull over, following us in the dark like a silent predator. I clenched my jaw, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Every nerve in my body screamed to confront him, to get out of the truck and finally end this sick game. But Maddie's hand grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Please. Just go. Let's not stay here." She was right. Rationally, I knew she was. This guy clearly didn't have anything good planned, and confronting him alone, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't bravery, it was foolishness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and put the truck into drive. Just as I started to pull away, something hit the back of the truck. A dull, metallic thud that rattled through the vehicle. I glanced back, heart pounding, catching only a glimpse of him, his face twisted into an eerie, almost expressionless look, as though he were simply observing, cold and calculating, as he melted back into the shadows again. Maddie was now full on crying, and that was the last straw. I floored the gas, tearing down the gravel road with a speed that bordered on reckless. The drive back to town felt like a feverish blur, each mile stretching longer than the last. My mind raced with questions, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, waiting for some flash of movement, some sign that he was still there, hiding in the darkness, following us. The thought of pulling into my driveway felt almost too hopeful, too safe, after everything we'd just gone through. But I had to get Maddie somewhere familiar, somewhere where we could both shake off the night's creeping dread. Finally, we pulled into her driveway, and I parked the truck, turning off the engine. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath, still half expecting him to appear from the trees or step out from behind a shadow. I walked her to her door, giving the neighborhood a thorough scan. Every bush, every tree seemed like it could be hiding him, and every sound, a creak, a distant dog bark, felt like a reminder that we hadn't truly escaped him. "You sure you'll be okay here?" I asked, my voice barely steady, though I tried to sound confident. She nodded, but the fear in her eyes mirrored my own. The drive back to my place was quiet, but that eerie whistle kept replaying in my head. I couldn't get it out of my mind, couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow missed something, that I'd left something unfinished. When I finally made it home, I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows, pulling the blinds shut and telling myself he was gone, that he wouldn't come looking for us again. But even as I lay in bed, the night seemed heavier, more oppressive, like he'd left an invisible shadow behind, following me. I knew I'd never go back to that beach again, not alone, not with anyone. Whatever his intentions were, that stranger had left a mark that went beyond fear. It was a reminder, a sick joke on his part, that he could find me whenever he wanted. In the weeks that followed, I scanned the local news, half expecting to read about a beachside stalker, or worse. But there was nothing, no reports, no signs of anyone like him. It was as if he had simply vanished, slipping into the shadows just as silently as he'd emerged. Maybe he was still out there, waiting for another unsuspecting couple to stumble into his twisted game. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd set his sights on someone else. Even now, months later, I find myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I'm alone at night. It's an instinct I can't shake, a habit born of that one night when the darkness itself seemed to breathe, and a stranger turned our quiet beach date into a nightmare I'll never forget. I don't know what his intentions were, and maybe that's the worst part. It's the not knowing that keeps you on edge, the endless loop of what if that haunts you. All I know is that he's still out there somewhere, and I can only hope no one else ever has to encounter him.